Hi, everybody. We are so excited to be joined by Cantor Leigh Korn, our colleague, and our rabbinic colleague, Rabbi Nicki Greninger. And they are here to talk to us about Onward Hebrew, which is a fast-growing movement spearheaded by Jewish education directors motivated to address the challenges of Hebrew learning in our supplemental education programs. And Leigh is, as you know, is our colleague and is a graduate of HUC JIR in 2005. And Nicki completed HUC JIR in 2008 and also has a master's in education. Is there anything else you guys want to say about yourselves before you kick it off?
That's great. No, I think it's great.
Okay.
So, if it's not totally obvious, and maybe it goes without saying, the reason that we wanted to present this topic, and in particular present it together, is that this whole idea, at least at Temple Isaiah in Lafayette, California, came about because we weren't totally satisfied with how our Hebrew education program was going. And I know that's true of many, many colleagues who perhaps don't feel like the students are getting everything they can out of the program, as well as not feeling like it's perhaps being taught or presented or programmed in such a way that it's really efficient and that students are really getting the most out of the time that they're putting in. We know that teaching decoding year after year is often lost in the summertime, and we have taken on a new approach. We have done this approach for many years now, and what I do want to say before I turn it over to Nicki is that really at the root, I think, of the success of this program is our partnership, as well as the work with all of the clergy at Temple Isaiah, and our teachers and our lay leadership, who have really gotten behind looking at this in a really new and different way, and have supported Nicki's efforts to really take Hebrew pedagogy to a really new level.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. We're going to do a kind of PowerPoint presentation type of thing. So just hold on one second while I do that. Okay, okay, can everybody see it? Yes, Leigh. Oops, I need to move the, hold on, the box of pictures. Okay. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slideshow. Can I get like a thumbs up or something? Okay, great. I want to take us back a number of years to this question of why make change. And as Leigh said, it has to start with some dissatisfaction with the status quo. And when I came to Temple Isaiah, I came after an educator who was really fabulous. We had a great education program here. But the one thing that really wasn't, I thought, very strong was Hebrew in the way that the kids learned Hebrew. So we changed it. Initially in my first year, we tried bringing in Meet Kadem, a program from the Reform movement. We did that for a couple of years. But it became clear after a couple of years that we needed to really rethink the model, that it's not just picking a different textbook from a different publisher, but it's about, why do we teach Hebrew? What are the goals? How could we think about this whole endeavor differently? So I became part of something that was originally called the Hebrew Project, and then eventually morphed into the B'nai Mitzvah Revolution. So many of you have probably heard of the B'nai Mitzvah Revolution, and our involvement in it was in part because of our efforts and interest in changing Hebrew as one element of B'nai Mitzvah learning and that life cycle event. So after I initially got connected with this Hebrew project, I created a task force at our congregation, a Hebrew task force of parents and teachers, our B'nai Mitzvah tutor, and myself, to really go through this process of rethinking everything. And it was about a 2-year process. And as Leigh mentioned, one of the important parts of making this type of change is really the trust and the relationship and the working together of clergy and lay leaders and also our teachers and parents, so that we're all kind of thinking about this together. So during that 2-year process, even though the other members of our clergy team were not on the task force, I was kind of the liaison where I was always bringing these things back to our clergy team, and here's what we're thinking about, and here's what we're talking about, and what do you think, and kind of working on that collaboratively. I will say that we did do some what I will call small experimentations along the way. And then the big change, the really doing things in a new way, began 5 years ago in 2013. So when we went through this change process, we one of the things that we did was to create a set of goals for our program. They're all listed on our website, so we'll give you that information later. But when we were trying to articulate our goals for learning Hebrew and prayer, we divided it into 3 categories that educators use sometimes. So what do we want our students to know? What do we want them to be able to do? And how do we want them to feel? And I'll say that when you look at our goals that we've listed, the goals under know and do are probably pretty similar to most of your congregations. You know, we want our students to, know all the letters in the alphabet. We want them to be able to sound out Hebrew words. We want them to be able to chant prayers, to chant Torah, etc. So those things aren't like revolutionary or anything. But the one area that I think is pretty different is an emphasis on this question of how they feel about it. That in many of our congregations, kids do eventually learn what we want them to learn, but many of them really dislike it or have a really negative experience of it. And just kind of anecdotally, I would say I think there's some kids for whom Hebrew like turns them off of Judaism. They're like, I don't like this, it's boring or it's hard or whatever. And so we really wanted whatever we created to focus on the affective component. How do kids feel about their experience learning? And in the end, our goal was that our students would still have the same level of competency in all of those areas of prayer and Hebrew, but that they would feel much more positively about it than maybe they used to. I want to give an overview of a little bit of terminology, but we'll come back to some of these ideas. The most important thing, the one thing I hope you come away with today is the idea of sound to print learning. This is the most important thing, that when we learn language, we don't learn a language by starting with the letters, by starting with the symbols. And that is actually how most of us probably teach Hebrew. It's how it's been taught in synagogues for a few generations now. So that means, looking at saying, this is a bet, it sounds like ba, and, then this is, the next letter, and sounding it all out together. But the problem with that is that humans learn language starting with sound. We hear it for a long, long time before we start to put it to these symbols on the page. So when you think about babies who are, just coming into the world and learning language, they hear people speaking the language for, usually a whole year before almost any other language development. The next thing to develop after sound is movement. So you'll say to a baby, wave bye-bye, and you kind of show them the movement. And then eventually they will start to be able to wave bye-bye even before they can say the words bye-bye. It's one of the reasons that sign language is so popular for baby sign language, because babies can make the sign before they can even speak. So we hear language, we do movements with language, then we add speaking. And then the last step, which in most cases is 3 or 4 or 5 years later, is learning the skill of reading. Because what reading is in the brain is that you see these symbols on the page, these squiggly lines and whatever it is, and you recognize that that's a symbol that goes along with a sound that you already know. And that when you put them together, it makes meaning. It makes a word. So you sound out C-A-T and you go cat, cat. Like there's a light bulb moment because you know what it is. You've heard it. You know what it means. So the way that we teach Hebrew for all these years is like the exact opposite. We start with the symbols, then we try to teach the sounds, and then we try to put it together and say, okay, and let me tell you, bayit means house, and like once they've sounded it out, now we tell them what it means. But that's really kind of the opposite of how language is naturally learned. So our whole approach is based on this sound to print philosophy. The woman who's written about it in a Hebrew context is Dr. Lifsa Schachter. She wrote a phenomenal article called Why Bonnie and Ronnie Can't Read the Siddur. I highly recommend that article. So that's the basis for this approach. There are 2 other important scholars and philosophies that I want to briefly mention, and then we'll come back to it later. One is about the notion of a meta-linguistic community. So this is the research of a scholar named Dr. Netta Avineri. She has done research on Yiddish communities in America. So she's gone to these Yiddish festivals and Yiddish events to try to understand what is it that how does the language work in these communities. And what she found is that if you go to one of these Yiddish festivals, people are so into Yiddish. They love it. They're really excited about it. And lo and behold, most people there don't really speak Yiddish, or at least not as their kind of full language. A small percentage do, maybe 5%. but most people are not, fluent Yiddish speakers. However, what binds them together as a community is the language. And the language binds them through words and phrases that they use, through greetings, through expressions, through songs, through, a variety of things that are part of the communal experience. And so she argues that what we ought to be thinking about in synagogues is creating a Hebrew meta-linguistic community. So it's not a linguistic community, meaning Hebrew is not the language that we're all speaking and using, but Hebrew is an element that binds our community together, that through Hebrew words and phrases and songs and blessings and all of that, that is part of our shared heritage. And it's what we, if we build this sense of we love it and it's who we are as our culture, then that's really what we're going for. That's a goal we can think about accomplishing. Another piece of this is the work of Dr. Sarah Benor. She's an HUC professor in LA. And she has, I think, coined the phrase ethno-linguistic infusion. So I'm going to talk more about this later, but this is kind of the means to creating a meta-linguistic community, is how do we infuse the culture with a particular language, even if it's not the language that everybody is speaking. So we'll talk about that in a few more minutes. So the question is, okay, so how do we teach Hebrew at Temple Isaiah? Hebrew Through Movement is one of the elements of our Hebrew program. Some of you, maybe many of you, have heard about Hebrew Through Movement. I think there are about 350 congregations that have now either adopted Hebrew Through Movement or are thinking about it or have trained teachers in this approach. So I understand that this might not be new for some of you, but I'll say a few words about it. The point of Hebrew Through Movement is that it is a type of language learning called TPR, Total Physical Response. It was developed in the Bay Area in the 1970s by a guy named James Asher, and it's used in languages all around the world to teach language. And the idea is that you learn by hearing and by doing. So going back to the way that humans learn language naturally. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of Simon Says, where the teacher gives a command in Hebrew and then the students have to do it. But it's not like Simon Says in that it's a full curriculum and it's very thoughtful, and it's not just sort of a game where you don't get out, nobody gets out. It's just this idea of teachers giving these commands and demonstrating, and then students learning to do it. So it starts with very basic Hebrew movement words, so lakum, lashevet, and the teacher will teach lakum and demonstrate standing up and then have students do it. And there are many, many great things about Hebrew Through Movement, but one of them is that it's a very social experience. It's a very communal experience. That if you don't know a word, you just look around and follow what everybody else is doing. If you don't know lakum and everybody stands up, then you should stand up. And, in the old way of teaching Hebrew, one of the challenges was that it felt very competitive for a lot of students. There's all these competitive games of like who can read it the fastest or whatever. And this is not a competition. And it's also not cheating to look at your neighbor. Like this is how we learn language, from these social cues. So you look to each other and kind of learn together. It's also meant to be very silly. So you can see the students where one is on a table and one is under the table. When the teacher gives the commands, they're supposed to do it in ways that are kind of surprising and fun for the kids, so that it's not always what's expected. So even if they're teaching something about, let's say matzah, they would teach le'echol matzah, but then they might also say something like, put the matzah on your head or something, just playing around with these movements. So it's fun, it's engaging, it's silly, and it also builds a sense of community. From the educational standpoint of the cognitive learning, it starts with all of these basic movements, but it builds in prayer and Jewish life or Jewish holiday vocabulary. So I mentioned about matzah. Another example would be teaching the word lahadlik, to light. So to lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah, but not in the teacher standing in front of the room and just saying lahadlik means to light. But they actually are, giving the command, and maybe 3 students are asked to come up and to light the candles, or, these students, or to jump over to the Hanukkah candles and light them, on that side of the room or whatever. So it builds in this vocabulary so that later on, when they do learn to read and they can sound out lahadlik, they know it, they've done it, it's in their bodies, both in their ears and in their physicality. They've done it in a physical way too. It also builds print literacy. So it starts very in this oral way of hearing and doing, but over time, you'll see the picture on the left on the floor, you can see the word ritzpah. So we do have Hebrew all around our rooms, but in addition, the teachers start to actually hold up signs to show words. So they'll show the word lakum and they'll say lakum, and then over time, they can just show the sign lakum and the students know what it says. And this is a building a vocabulary through sight words. So we all know that we do this in English, that you learn the word stop because you've seen it on a stop sign, even if you haven't learned all the letters and how to sound it out. So it's the same in Hebrew, that you can learn all of these sight words even before you've learned each individual letter. So that is done in Hebrew through movement. I'll back up and just say that Hebrew through movement is done about 10 to 15 minutes at a time. And we do that in all of our grades starting in kindergarten, actually starting with our kind of preschool cohort, but then into kindergarten and through 6th grade. And they do 10 to 15 minutes every single time they come to our education program. Another part of our Hebrew approach is called Jewish life vocabulary. So this gets at this question of why are we teaching Hebrew in the first place? Well, of course, we want them to learn prayers and eventually to learn to chant Torah, but we also want them to be educated American Jews. We are realistic that we are not teaching them fluency in modern Hebrew. We do not expect that our students are going to be able to do that in the limited time that we have. You know, maybe someday we hope they'll take it in college or whatever, but we don't have that, capacity. But we do want them to be able to speak what Dr. Benor calls Jewish English, which is that we all speak English as our native language here, but there's a certain sort of Jewish English that includes a lot of Hebrew words and phrases. And what that sounds like is different in a Reform synagogue than maybe in a Chabad community. You know, the types of words and phrases we use might be a little bit different. But we want them to be able to incorporate those things into their life and vocabulary. So for example, we want them to know if somebody says Yasher Koach, what that means. We want them to know Chag Sameach. We want them to know what Gimilut Chasadim is, all of those things. So our goal is to incorporate these, what we call Jewish life vocabulary words into everything that we do. I should say that our education program is called JQuest. So here it says to integrate them into all our JQuest programs from kindergarten through 7th grade. And by doing so, we're trying to create this Hebrew meta-linguistic community, a community in which Hebrew is part of the experience. And this brings us to the, I'll actually skip to the bottom thing, where this idea that it's ethno-linguistic infusion. So you could see this fruit infusion thing. I don't know, I've never made a fruit infusion. But the idea is that there's this water and then the fruit is there, but you'll see that the fruit is not actually in the water. So if you think of the fruit like the Hebrew, you know, these are not Hebrew speakers, but it's infused into the water and it actually changes the water so that the water feels like Hebrewish, I'll put it that way. So the best way I can explain this is, so I have 3 kids and my youngest is 3, and we have letters, ABCs, English letters in the bath, like foam bath letters. And a lot of us maybe have had that when kids are young. And, you know, I don't sit with my kid and say, this is a B, like, let's practice the letter B. Like, that's not how it works. The way it works is that there's letters in the bath and he plays with them and he throws them and he, you know, hits his sister on the head with one, and you know, he like plays with them. And then over time, as they get a little older, sometimes they do start to say, oh, you know, G, my name starts with B, you know, and they start to kind of recognize things, but it's in a playful way. So the idea of ethno-linguistic infusion is that the language is in the water. So in my bath example, it's like literally in the water. But in our communities, this idea that Hebrew letters and words and phrases and songs are just in the water. It's in the culture. We want that to be infused into everything that we do. So this is a very different way of thinking about Hebrew education. It's not like Hebrew school is these, you know, at this hour or these 2 hours, and then we do Judaics. You know, the idea is Hebrew is infused into our educational environment. So when we began this, we tried to give our teachers a Jewish life vocabulary list and just tell them to use it. And that didn't really work because there's too much and they didn't remember. So what we do now is that we have a Hebrew letter of the week and we have Jewish life vocabulary of the week. So for example, if the letter of the week is bet, then it's bet for the whole school. It's kind of like Sesame Street. Like, this week is brought to you by the letter bet. And there's the sign with a bet when you come in, and then each class might do a little something with bet. But by little something, I mean like a minute or two. Like they might make a yoga pose out of bet, or they do a little Play-Doh thing with bet. But it's just like a couple minutes. It's not a long lesson. It's not a workbook. It's just kind of a little something to kind of bring that letter in. And then we have a certain vocabulary of the week. So maybe this week the vocabulary is bavakasha or something. So the teacher will teach it and then just use it that day as part of the class. And then over the course of the next weeks and months, hopefully once they've taught that word, it will start to be used kind of in the class more regularly. So that's how Jewish Life vocabulary works. So another very important element of our approach to teaching Hebrew is, of course, tefillah. And Leigh is going to say more about it, but what I want to start by saying is that tefillah, teaching Hebrew are not the same thing. They're different things, but they are, of course, intertwined. That one of the ways we want our students to learn Hebrew is through prayer, is by singing prayers, doing prayers, that we feel the best way to learn tefillah is to participate in tefillah. So they're coming here, they're praying, they're hearing the prayers, and they're doing that as part of their educational experience, and that builds a Hebrew oral vocabulary. So Leigh is going to explain sort of how we do that. We break it up into groups, and
So I would say one of the key things that's really important to understand is that every time a student comes for a JQuest session, they're engaging in tefillah, without exception, no matter what their age is, no matter how many days a week they come. If they come 2 days a week for JQuest, if they come on Sunday and a midweek, they have tefillah every single time. Those tefillah sessions are divided into 3 groups. So we have a K through 2 tefillah, a 3rd through 6th grade tefillah, and a separate 7th grade tefillah. And I'll get to that 7th grade tefillah in a moment. Each of those, the K through 2 and the 3 through 6 tefillah, are always led by clergy. So there's always a rabbi or a cantor at each of those services. And we use a combination of tools depending on the age and the setting. We use visual tefillah. Whenever we use visual tefillah, there is both Hebrew and transliteration, both on the screen. And of course, the Mishkan Tefillah edition that we use with our students also does have transliteration. And we rely and encourage the use of transliteration. Getting back to what Nicki was saying earlier, as far as being able to access this, the words and the ability to chant and sing and recite, transliteration is really important. Even the students who have already, we haven't gotten sort of to our decoding section, but even those who are learning to decode will have a very hard time truly reciting Hebrew or chanting Hebrew at as the slide says, at synagogue speed. So we don't pretend it's not there. We don't have them cover that section of the page, but we understand that that is actually also an important tool for them to engage with tefillah. The K through 2 and the 3rd through 6th grade tefillot resemble the services that our community prays when we are together as a community outside of JQuest. So while the liturgy itself, as far as the prayers we're using, are weekday tefillah, melodies that we might use are the melodies that they're going to be used to hearing when they come on Shabbat to participate in the greater community. So the nusach, we do not use weekday nusach in those tefillah because, again, we want them to be able to engage and participate and feel like when they come to pray with the larger community, they're able to do so. The exception with the liturgy is the 7th grade tefillah. And the reason that that is separate is that we do use that almost as like a tefillah lab for our B'nai Mitzvah students. The opportunity for them to pray a Shabbat morning service is that at Temple Isaiah, that's the service that they will most participate in when they become a bar mitzvah. And the students understand, and they know when they transition from 6th grade to 7th grade, that this is a new service, that this is not the same as the service they've been praying for the last 6-7+ years, but rather that we are now having this lab experience that begins with, in this case, I usually lead the 7th grade tefillah, that leads with me leading, but ultimately, and quite quickly, transitions to the students leading the services themselves. Usually they are assigned a session where they will lead tefillah, and usually that is in the order that they become bar mitzvah. So usually by the beginning of the year, there are students becoming bar mitzvah, let's say in the month of October or November. Those are the first students who will lead. I will also add that the students also have the opportunity to chant Torah as part of 7th grade tefillah. They have an opportunity to model for their classmates what they are learning, and usually that happens as late even as the week of their bar mitzvah. One more chance for them to have an opportunity to participate in that way.
So for the sake of, when we were talking about today, we were saying that, the question of how to teach tefillah is also an important question, and could be its whole own other webinar. So when we get to the time of Q&A, if any of you want to ask questions, we can certainly address it. But our feeling is that for today, the purpose of talking about this tefillah is more in the question of how our students are, tefillah is one component of how they're learning Hebrew, and that they're learning it in this kind of oral way. They're hearing it, they're doing it, they're reciting it. As my colleague, Rabbi Stacy Rigler in Philadelphia says, they're learning it often by heart, right? They're hearing it, and it's like in their ears and in their hearts. And as she says, like, sometimes we're sort of, almost mad or disappointed, like, oh, they memorized it, they didn't really read it. And it's like, but isn't that a great thing? Don't we want it in their hearts? Like, that's actually kind of a good thing. And so anyway, that's tefillah piece. So then we get to the $24,000 question, which is, so when and how do we actually teach them to read Hebrew? So I think you have to start with the question of, how do kids learn to read English? And remember what I said early on about what reading actually is. So reading is seeing these symbols on the page and recognizing that these symbols make sounds. And when you put those sounds together, they make meaning. They mean something, a word. And that is very different than decoding, which is, recognizing that the symbol makes a sound and you can sound it out, but you don't really know what it means. That is not really reading. So our goal is to try to have our kids learn to read Hebrew, that they sound it out and they actually know what they're reading. Now, again, I want to emphasize that we can't do this in a full way in terms of fluency. Like, our kids are never going to be at the point where they can just pick up a book in Hebrew and read it and understand it all. We do not have the time in our settings, and we don't give homework, and there's a million reasons why we can't do that. But in order to learn reading Hebrew that's beyond decoding, they have to have this oral foundation of the language. They have to have heard Hebrew a lot. It has to be in your ears, so that then when you sound it out, you're like, oh, I've heard that before. You're familiar with the sound. So the oral piece is really important. They also need to know a lot of Hebrew words, so that, when they sound out lahadlik, they know what it means because they've heard it before. They also really need to be motivated, and they need to have a clear goal. So in English, or, for young children in America, learning to read English is motivating for many of them because they have to for school, or because, it's to be part of our culture. For our kids, we all know what the motivation is. For most of them, it's bar bat mitzvah. So it's one of the reasons that it's challenging sometimes to teach kids how to read Hebrew when they're in like 2nd or 3rd grade. Some of them are just intrinsically motivated because it's kind of fun for them. But for a lot of kids, the motivation is really more connected to the bar bat mitzvah. The other thing that's super important is consistent attendance and practice. You cannot teach a student to read a language, any language, but certainly Hebrew, if they're not doing it consistently, and if they're not practicing it. And we don't give homework in our program. I don't know about other congregations, but I think it's not common practice to give homework from religious school. And so the question is, how can we build that consistency in attendance and in practice? And so, and I'll just say that the way that we used to teach Hebrew in at least in our synagogue, where it's in the classroom and with a workbook and with a teacher, part of the problem of that methodology is that a teacher teaches, let's say, the letter bet, and a third of the class isn't there. And then next week, she teaches Gimel, and a different third of the class isn't there. So then by the 3rd lesson, she's ready to move on to Daled, and some of the kids don't know Bet. Some of them don't know Gimel. Some don't know both because they were gone both weeks. Some of them already know both and are totally ready to move on. So you compound that by many weeks, many years, and you can see why so many students still don't know all the letters after 5 years of dealing with that kind of learning. So what we created is something that we call a Hebrew boot camp. And so, do you want to talk about boot camp?
Sure.
Okay. So Leigh will explain how the boot camp works.
So I think I'll just echo what Nicki was saying first, and say that what we try to do, because again, we have found that trying to have them decode for years and years before they really have to put it into practice has not been effective, is that we actually teach them to decode really as late as possible in the process. So for our
and once, I should say,
yeah.
and just to jump in, once they've had all this other Hebrew learning, that they've had years and years of singing prayers and doing Hebrew through movement and Jewish life vocabulary and letter of the week. So they've seen and heard all the Hebrew letters, all these words, all these blessings. It's not like we're hiding it from them or anything, but they've had all this scaffolding before we feel like the reading is the last step rather than the first step.
Great. So I'm going to start sort of halfway down the slide and just tell you that we use a program called Let's Learn Hebrew Side by Side. And it's something that you can look up online. The web page is there, letslearnhebrew.org. It is a web-based Hebrew program. It is divided into 24 lessons, and we have chosen to combine lessons so that we do it essentially in 12 units. The program is really fantastic. It is really focused on exactly this skill set, that is to say, really just learning decoding. However, it also piggybacks on what Nicki was saying, which is a lot of important vocabulary that students already know or perhaps are on the verge of knowing. The program is actually designed in such a way that the person teaching the student might also not be a Hebrew student themselves or somebody who is familiar with the language. It is designed to be worked essentially with a mentor or a teacher and the student. And we have decided at Temple Isaiah that we have offered two modes by which they can do this program. One is through a cadre of really phenomenal. We're really grateful for having a real phenomenal cadre of volunteer mentors who commit to teaching each student for 12 one-hour sessions. Here at Temple Isaiah, the students come here and they work with the tutor and a computer. And you'll see there's a little picture of one of our mentors and students on the screen. But we also give the opportunity for the students to do this program at home. And they can work with a parent or a grandparent. They come in for a single sort of tutorial just to understand how the program works. And they can do this program at home as well. I want to add that in addition to the online component, there's also a hands-on component. So when you finish an online lesson, there's actually a physical hands-on part of the program that might involve matching flashcards or putting words in a certain order or reading. And we provide all of those materials, obviously, to our mentors, but also we have packets that we send home if the families choose to do this at home.
Great. So the important thing to emphasize here, I would say, in addition to what Leigh said, is that it's one-on-one. It's really important that it's one-on-one because kids learn at different paces and need to review certain things or whatever. And so getting back to that idea of consistency, that, you're not going to just miss a letter or something because you missed that day. Like, they're working one-on-one with their mentor or with their parent at home, and they are going to go through the program. So it is an hour a week for 12 weeks. We do that right before they're going to start their bar and bat mitzvah tutoring. And generally that tends to be around 11 months before their bar bat mitzvah date. So we work backwards from the date of their bar bat mitzvah to figure out when boot camp is going to start. And we have a coordinator who oversees those logistics, looking at the calendar, figuring out who's supposed to start when, matching them to mentors, etc.
The other nice piece of having it be an online or a web-based program is that we can also track the progress of our students. So each student has a unique login, and we have an idea then if they are doing it at home, we can check in on how their progress is going and where they're at with the program.
Right. So we just wanted to say a brief word about just in general B'nai Mitzvah preparation at Temple Isaiah, because we know every synagogue does it differently. So just so you have a sense of kind of what that looks like. Yeah.
So just when I've spoken to other cantors about our program, that's sort of the next question. It's like, well, when do you start and how much do you do? So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea of what our program looks like so you can see sort of how these connect one to the next, how one gets to the next. So in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, we do have 3 family programs each year that are designed to familiarize them with what bar and bat mitzvah is, what Torah is, a little bit about learning about parshiot and just different family education components that allows them to really feel prepared mentally and emotionally for becoming bar bat mitzvah. Then there's our boot camp program, which, as Nicki says, we count back essentially from when their tutoring begins. So in an ideal scenario, they would finish their last week of boot camp, their last week of the Let's Learn Hebrew side by side, learning their final letter. I think there's just one letter in the last lesson. And then the following week, they would sit down with their tutor and begin to if they need some review on prayers, and also start their Torah portion. Our students tutor for 6 months. They have a 30-minute-a-week lesson with a tutor. That is at our synagogue, a professional tutor. That is not the person that they have done boot camp with. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an idea, our students, as I'm sure yours do, lead all the main prayers of the service. As far as how much Hebrew they do in the service, our students usually each chant 4 aliyot, which constitutes anywhere from, I would say, 12 to 18 verses of Torah, as well as often Haftarah, and so that's the Hebrew.
And they
piece.
and on Friday they do the full kiddush,
right.
And I don't know, a handful of other things.
Yeah.
Great. And then they also, of course, have meetings with the Cantor and with the Rabbi, etc.
Right.
Okay. So we want to say a few things about some of the successes that we found. One of the successes has been really rethinking the goals and the methods. So as I said, it's not just saying, well, which publisher's workbook are we going to use, but really to sit back and say, well, what are our goals? And then what methods might meet those goals. Also, we took the decoding out of JQuest. That the bootcamp model works very well, we think, partly because of this one-on-one nature of it, that we actually tried to do the bootcamp during JQuest and when we first changed our program, and that did not work. The students just didn't show up consistently. They weren't very committed to it. And the timing wasn't always so great with when their bar bat mitzvah was. So doing it completely separately from JQuest has been really great for our community. And also, I think it elevates the level of importance for the families, that they feel like this is important. They need to show up. They need to make it work with their mentor. So that's worked really well here. Oopsies. Is that the last? Oh, yeah, I guess so. So related to that, I wanted to address the question of, well, so, some parents or others might say, well, why didn't they already learn to read Hebrew in like second grade? I learned it in second or third grade when I was in synagogue. And so this picture and slide comes from my colleague, Rabbi Rigler, who I mentioned before. She also runs a program called JQuest in Philadelphia. And she says, well, why not teach these second graders to decode Hebrew? And here are the reasons. If you look at this group, 3 of them have special needs and are going to need help. And 4 of them are new to the program and haven't learned any Hebrew yet. And 2 of them, only show up a couple times a year. And 3 of them are, very committed and interested and are going to race ahead and then be bored. And also, Hebrew as a language is a little bit different than English, because most English letters are the same no matter which direction they face. So like the best example I can think of is like an R. It doesn't matter if an R is upside down or sideways or whatever, it's still an R. But in Hebrew, the letters, it really matters what direction they are, because many of them actually are the same shape, just in a different way. And so if you think about in English, we do have that a little bit with B, D, P, and Q, that it's more or less the same shape, but just in a different orientation. And kids often are still confusing B, D, P, and Q up through at least 3rd grade. And then also, how many of them will get excited in this first year of learning to decode, but 5 years from now are going to be totally unmotivated. And we know that all of them will forget 40% over the summer. There's a lot of research on this, that no matter how much they learn throughout the year, over the summer they tend to lose about 40% of it. So that is why doing it one of the many reasons that doing it later really makes a difference. This is a better approach for our teachers, because it allows them to teach Hebrew in ways that they are comfortable with and familiar with. It's very hard to find good Hebrew teachers. It's hard even Hebrew speakers don't necessarily have Hebrew pedagogy. So the way it works for us is that we have 2 Hebrew specialists who go around to the classes doing Hebrew through movement, and they're trained in Hebrew through movement. The main classroom teachers do the Jewish life vocabulary. They incorporate the letter of the day, the vocabulary of the week. So their job is that ethno-linguistic infusion piece. And then the decoding piece is done one-on-one with one of our mentors or a parent. So it's really much better for the teachers. And it's more time for other things. It's not like we have X amount of, this hour and a half is Hebrew and then this time is everything else. But we have, 10 or 15 minutes of Hebrew through movement. We have a couple minutes of the Jewish life vocabulary or letter of the week piece. And then, of course, we have tefillah, which is 30 minutes. So you could look at our whole 2 hours that they're here and say, 45 minutes of that is Hebrew learning in some way or another. But we have time for all these other things that we want to do because Hebrew is infused in everything. So it's not separating out the Hebrew time in quite the same way that I know many synagogues do. So one thing that I think is important to share is that we've been doing research on this for the last 5 years. And as part of the research, we're looking at 3 categories. What is the student's competence? Competence in 2 areas, in decoding or reading, and competence in prayer recitation. We also have been looking at confidence and attitude. So confidence meaning how good at Hebrew do they feel they are, and attitude, how positive, or negative do they feel about Hebrew. So, and we do a survey of the students every year. We survey parents. Our B'nai Mitzvah tutors have been filling out an intake that when the students start with their tutors, we see where they're at with their Hebrew abilities and confidence and attitude. And we've also done interviews with students, with parents, with teachers, with the tutors. And so far from this, we have seen pretty good results, I would say. So this is just an example. One of the questions we ask students in the survey is, overall, do you like learning Hebrew? So this is a different question than asking them specifically, like, do you like Hebrew through movement, for example? But when we ask them, overall, do you like learning Hebrew? You'll see, out of 117 responses, only, about 20% had something negative to say, and the others said that they either love it or they like it. And so, we can't win them all, or we aren't quite at 100% yet. But it feels to me like, 80% feeling positive about learning Hebrew is great. We don't have any baseline data, but my gut tells me that in the previous way of doing things, it was probably the exact opposite. Maybe 20% of them liked it, and maybe 80% had more negative things to say. But that's just a guess. I don't know. So Stacy in Philadelphia has also been collecting some data. Every single year, at the end of the year, they test their 6th graders on a decoding test. It's from Berman House. It's a kind of standardized test type of thing where they have to do a bunch of decoding types of things. And you'll see here, so the current grade says what grade they're in now, but this was the score from when they were in 6th grade. So the 11th graders, 5 years ago when they were in 6th grade, the average score was 90%, and that was with this many hours of decoding practice or learning in class. So you'll see over time, her congregation, like ours, has been going with this approach of rethinking Hebrew, and they do decoding later now. And you can see that her 7th graders only did decoding for 2 years. They had about 47 hours of decoding learning, and their scores were, just as high or higher than doing it in the previous way. So this is a different kind of evidence that this method works. I'll also say that one of the things people ask me is like, well, how do they do it their bar bat mitzvah? And the answer I usually give is, well, I think they do pretty well. I've never heard otherwise from our clergy. So, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
No, they're very well prepared. And it's, I actually think in some ways it's really enhanced their learning in the process because they're also really coming off of the Hebrew boot camp. There's a certain freshness that they're
excited.
They're excited, and they've just learned this new skill over the course of just 12 weeks, and they're ready to put it to use. And I think our tutors find that they're really eager, and the knowledge feels very fresh to them.
Right. So I've interviewed our tutors, and I've written up an article that's hopefully going to be published this year that is actually looking at that transition into the tutoring. Because you could say, oh, well, maybe they're good at their bar bat mitzvah just because of what the tutors are doing. But the tutors have talked about what they see in students coming in, and it's exactly that they're just very positive about all of it. And the tutor says, okay, I want you to read this. And instead of the typical eye roll, like, oh, I'm so annoyed, the students are like, okay, I'll do it. And they're very connected to prayer as well. It doesn't feel like it's something they've been kind of banging their head over for years and years and years. There are struggles, there are challenges, so we want to acknowledge that. I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is about, I would say it's sort of a PR issue. So when we changed our approach 5 years ago, there was really strong community buy-in because we went through this 2-year process. There were all these voices at the table, part of the conversation, so people were really enthusiastic. But because that was a long time ago and now this is just the norm, we struggle with some families for really understanding what we do and why we do it and how it works, particularly because every year we have new families. So if somebody will move here or start our program and they just they don't really get it. They're like, well, why isn't my child learning Hebrew? Because their third grader can't read, isn't able to decode yet, or their fifth grader isn't decoding. And they're like, what's going on over there? You guys aren't teaching any Hebrew. And so I think this really having a sea change in thinking about what does it mean to learn Hebrew, and that decoding is not the only barometer for learning Hebrew, and that by the end they will have learned everything that we want them to learn and feel really positive about it. But they are learning Hebrew. They're just learning it in a different way. They're learning the vocabulary. They're learning it through movement. They're learning it in this totally different approach. So that PR kind of building buy-in is an ongoing thing of re-educating people every year. And as I said, how best to communicate with parents. I've sent stuff in the mail. We send home lists of things they've learned, but they don't read it, or they half read it.
We have YouTube videos that explain which you can find on our website also.
Right. So this is our ongoing question of how to best communicate with parents. I will say some things work and others don't. We have tried things that didn't work. I mentioned trying to do this boot camp during JQuest, which didn't work very well. We've also tried some Hebrew electives that didn't really work very well. So not everything works, but it's an ongoing process. The other thing is that integrating Jewish life vocabulary, creating this Hebrew meta-linguistic community, I will say doesn't always come naturally to our teachers. It depends. Some of them it does, and some of them it doesn't. It depends on how much Hebrew they grew up with or feel comfortable using. Some of them feel very comfortable saying todah instead of thank you, but others, it's just not their first inclination. So trying to help the teachers use this vocabulary, feel comfortable with it, and have it be part of the culture in the way that we want it to is something that I continue to work on. And the JECC, the Jewish Education Center of Cleveland, has been a real pioneer in developing a lot of the materials that we're using. They developed Hebrew Through Movement. They developed Let's Learn Hebrew Side by Side. They are working on developing some resources in this Jewish life vocabulary piece so that other congregations can adapt and teach their teachers, etc. Okay, so we have a little 2-minute wrap up for at the very end, but before that, we thought we'll take a breath and switch over to Q&A. So I think are we still on your screen? Anyway, I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, so I know you've all probably muted yourselves, but if you have questions, you can unmute yourself or put it in. We're happy to answer. Oh, okay, cool.
So I'm happy to start with a question. When you move from boot camp into the bar and bat mitzvah year, are you looking for them to be then starting to decode a vote, for example, or are you relying on transliteration and rote learning?
So I will say that remember what I started with, that sound to print is the philosophy. So when they get to their tutor, yes, we want them to be able to decode all of the things that they will be doing, kiddush and avot, bimahot, and all of that stuff. But they already have the sounds in their ears because they've been doing it in tefillah. So when they sit there with the words on the page, yes, we want them to be able to sound it out, and that they do work on that, I think, with the tutors. Mm-hmm. But it's easy for them because they actually already really know the words. It's in their ears already. So then they're just matching the symbols to the sounds, and it's a much easier process. They're not cracking their teeth on every single sound.
Right, and what they are working with, it's just a photocopied thing that we call our student Sidur, it's basically their practice edition that they use with the tutors that is not a photocopy out of Mishkan Tefillah. That particular one is only the Hebrew. And what I will tell you that sort of speaks to the great success is that I often give the students, not often, I always give the students the choice at the bar mitzvah. Do they want to use the student Sidur that they've been practicing with their tutor, which is only the Hebrew, or would they rather use the regular Sidur? It really makes no difference to me. The words are coming out of their mouth. It doesn't matter to me where that's rooted. And I will say probably 80% of the time they want to use the student Sidur.
Because that's what they've been
practicing with, and that's what they feel very comfortable with.
And the irony in that is that we actually give them a Siddur in one of the 5th grade family programs. So they have their own Siddur. It's personalized. They've used it in JQuest Tefillah for years and years. So they have their own personalized one that they also could use, and some of them do. But the fact that they want to use the student Siddur means they feel comfortable enough, without the transliteration and with the one they've been practicing with. So, they have that skill. But again, so there's a great blog post by Joel Hoffman that is the role of transliteration in the synagogue. And that article changed my view on transliteration, because what he talks about is that the cat's out of the bag. Like, they all know we have transliteration in our prayer books. Every Reformed synagogue today pretty much does, because it's an important tool. We have tons of people in our communities who don't know Hebrew, and we want them to participate in prayer. And so I want to echo what Leigh said, which is that we want them to feel comfortable with the Hebrew, that they can read the Hebrew, they know it, it's an important gateway. At the same time, if they're sitting in a service, I actually don't care if they're following along in the Hebrew or in the transliteration, because at the end of the day, what I care about is their participation in tefillah and feeling connected to the prayer and feeling confident and capable in saying the prayers. So that's a question of prayer recitation more than it is reading. So I'd like for them to be able to read it. I think it's an important skill to read Hebrew. But for the purpose of that experience of praying, I don't feel strongly. So anyway.
And Leigh, are you teaching trope? Or are they learning the portion by rote?
Yes, they learn. Yes.
Well, some of them learn it.
Some of them learn it in 5th and 6th grade. So we have, this is a totally other webinar, but our JQuest program is actually divided into, it's a subject-based program as opposed to a grade-based program. The students who opt to take the track called Shirah, which is, by the way, not an elective, it's the full immersion program, do get trope in 5th and 6th grade. The rest of the students, it really is on a per student basis, as I'm sure it is with many of you as well. Some students really take to it. Other students rely more on a recording, but they all learn the basic groups of trope with their tutors. Yes.
Thanks.
Anna?
Oh, we can't hear you. She doesn't look muted, though.
Anna, you're muted.
Well,
it says muted.
I know, but
Now you're unmuted.
Her sound's not working.
Anna,
your sound's not working.
Anna, your sound's not. Can you type it into the box?
The chat box.
Yeah, I don't even see it anymore. Oh, at the bottom.
Okay.
You can bring it back up. I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Well, while she's doing that, are there other questions that you want to ask? No.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Haley.
Hi. So first, it sounds really fantastic and very exciting what you guys are doing. I am a little bit curious. What is the time requirement in your JQuest program? Not counting the year of bar or bat mitzvah when it ratchets up between boot camp and the one-on-one coaching, but on a regular basis, is this a 1-day-a-week program, a 2-day-a-week program?
So the kids, the youngest kids up to 2nd grade come 1 day a week for 2 hours, Sunday mornings. And the older kids starting in 3rd grade, 3rd through 7th grade, come twice a week. They come once on Sundays and once during the week. They have a couple of different choices of which day, but they come once midweek. And each of those, the Sunday and the weekday, are 2 hours. So they come for a total of 4 hours. And every time they come, they have tefillah for about a half an hour. So it's, an hour and a half of other stuff and a half an hour of tefillah. And the Sunday tefillah is either at the beginning or the end of the time, and most parents come with their kids. And the weekday tefillah is right in the middle of the 2 hours, and so very few parents come to that. And that is intentionally in the middle, because I found that the weekdays, sometimes they would come late or leave early because they were like, oh, I'll just skip tefillah, and we don't want that. So it's in the middle. But Sundays, we want the parents there, and they do often come. So
Anna's
I see the question from Anna. So why didn't boot camp work in the classroom? So there's many reasons. So keep in mind that this boot camp is meant to be one-on-one. So a student is working, sitting next to and with an adult. And so we asked for a bunch of volunteers from our congregation, adults who just, were interested in doing this, to come and volunteer their time to meet with a student. So first of all, it's actually challenging to get a whole bunch of people all here at the same time. Like, we need everybody on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. So that was one initial challenge. But even once we figured that out and we got enough volunteers to come, the students, they just don't come 100% of the time. And so I had emailed those families and said, you are matched with so-and-so, you're going to be working with Stephen for the next 12 weeks on this boot camp. If you can't come, please make sure to let us know so that you're mentored, doesn't come without your student or whatever. And nevertheless, they still didn't tell us that they weren't coming. So these mentors, who are just the most wonderful volunteers, would show up and then their student wouldn't be there. So it was a waste of time for the mentor, and then the students, or the students would come, but they come a half an hour late. So now they missed half the lesson. Or the other thing we found is that even though each lesson is designed to be about a half an hour, so with 24 lessons, it's about 12 hours of time. We know that not every student's the same. Some go slower, some go faster, and there are some that it just takes longer. So even though in theory it's a 3-month program, we give them 4 months. We have them start the boot camp 4 months before their tutoring starts. When we tried to do it in the context of JQuest, we had like a 3-month window. It was like these 12 weeks, all these students are going to do boot camp. And not only did they miss some of them, but then some of them just were going slower. And so the problem was they weren't going to finish by the end of the first semester. And our plan was that half the class would do fall semester and half the class would do spring semester of 6th grade. And that just really did not work. Like they weren't done in time. They hadn't showed up enough. So then we need to start the new students in January and we weren't ready, And the other thing is that then there was sometimes a really big gap. Like if you're going to end in May when the school year ends, but you don't start your bar bat mitzvah tutoring until November because you have a later bar bat mitzvah date, it's a really long lag time. And we felt like the closer those two things can be, the better, the more it's fresh on their minds, they're enthusiastic. So, yeah.
And the way it's designed now, there are some times that students are behind, or they did miss 2 weeks, or they started a week late, or the only sort of downside of that becomes that there's sometimes some overlap. So there's sometimes some overlap between the boot camp and the tutoring.
Right.
And that does happen sometimes. I would say it's not the norm, but it's less detrimental to have a little bit of overlap versus a long gap, when they're not.
Yeah. I will say logistically, I just sent the link about transliteration. I will say logistically, for about a year or two, we had a problem, which was that the boot camp was often overlapping with tutoring and a little too much. Like they just didn't have enough time to finish boot camp, because even though they're more committed now because it's not in JQuest, even still, kids get sick, they're out of town, they're on vacation, they're at summer camp, like things happen. Or the mentor, they're a great mentor, but they're going on vacation for 2 weeks or whatever. So we decided to build in now this extra month as kind of a cushion so that they have literally 16 weeks to do 12 weeks. And that has made it more feasible. The other thing is we have kids with special needs, just like every congregation does. And we usually know by 6th grade what those needs are, how much time they might need, how far in advance we might need to start them. So some kids we just start earlier with the boot camp. The other thing is that I like to say is that we're not hiding this from anybody. So if there's a 4th grader who really wants to learn to read Hebrew, then I'm happy to set them up with boot camp. And we've done that on occasion. So, it's not like we're forcing them to wait longer. It's just that we found that most of them are not that interested or motivated or kind of ready until a little bit later. So, yeah. So I don't know how firm we are on time. It's 11:30.
Yeah.
And we do have like 2 more little brief slides. So should we do that, or should we take
I think so. I think we probably do need to wrap. Thank you guys so much.
Oh, hold on. Can I take 1 minute so that we can
Sure.
share this? How do I have to go back and share my screen. I just want to give you some like next steps if this is something that interests you. So, okay, so first of all, just very briefly, some lessons that we've learned, that you have to know your community. Certain things that work here may not work somewhere else. So, knowing your community, but at the same time, don't be afraid of change. We do not have to do it the same way we've been doing it. As we talked about, it's important to get buy-in. Doing kind of a change process is helpful for that. It's really important to set goals, and that the partnerships with lay leaders is important. And I'll also mention adding Hebrew through movement is a great place to start. If you want to just experiment with something, adding that in is great. And I can put in the chat box the link to the website. But it's just the first step. It's one part of a new way of thinking about Hebrew. It's not the only piece. It's not like just starting Hebrew through movement sort of is the end goal here. So next steps. So what can you do if you are interested in this? So Onward Hebrew is the name that we've given to this kind of general approach. And so I would recommend there's an Onward Hebrew website, there's an Onward Hebrew Facebook group, that those are good places to go to learn more, to get more information, and to figure out kind of where you might want to start. And most importantly, the first two things listed here is to talk to your educator if you are not also the educator, and encourage him or her to learn more about this. I've given talks at ARJE, and there have been opportunities, but I'm also happy to connect with people now. And of course, talk to your rabbi, encourage him or her to learn more. The more that there's a partnership of the clergy and the educator, the more likely that this will be successful, because changing the way Hebrew is taught can be kind of a hot button issue for people. So we want it to be something that everybody's on board with. So, anything else? No.
I don't think so.
All right.
I hope I'll see some of you in Dallas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all. Oh, I'll tell you, I'll just put in the chat box the Hebrew Through Movement website and the Onward Hebrew website too. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.